My name is Gary Wolfram. I'm a professor of economics at Hillsdale College and on the advisory board for the Durrell Foundation organization here, our event. And I'm honored to be able to moderate for such a distinguished group of panelists on a very important topic. Regulation has a number of problems. As Mr. Laffer said, it has its role, but you have to think about it has a cost of compliance, and those costs are substantial. Anybody that how many out here have ever run their own business? Well, you know about this then, right? So there's a cost of compliance, but it also expands the role of government. There's an idea that we need to get out and I need to regulate your behavior because I know better than you how you ought to behave. And finally, it creates uncertainty that makes it have less incentive. Mr. Laffer was talking about incentives, but much less incentive to innovate when you don't know what's going to be happening, when you don't know whether your product is going to be allowed or your technique's going to be allowed. So our panelists are going to address these issues and some other ideas. And I'd just like to introduce our first panelist. And our first panelist is going to be Peter Wallison. And he's going to speak on the effect of financial regulation. And he holds the Arthur Burns Chair in Financial Market Studies at AEI, which is a very nice organization. Some of you are probably very familiar with that. And he's co-director of the AEI's program on financial policy studies. He's practiced law privately for many years and was general counsel of the Treasury Department from 1981 to 1985 and White House counsel for President Reagan in 1986 and 1987. He's the co-author of several books, including Ronald Reagan, The Power of Conviction, and the Success of His Presidency. And I like this one, Bad History, Worse Policy, How a False Narrative About the Financial Crisis Led to the Dodd-Frank Act. His most recent book is Hidden in Plain Sight, What Caused the World's Worst Financial Crisis and Why It Could Happen Again, unfortunately, published just this year. So I'd like you to help me welcome Mr. Wallison.
Thank you very much, Gary. It really is a pleasure to be here. This is the first time I've been to one of these conferences by Hillsdale, and I must say they are really serious and interesting. I mean, the audience is very much engaged, and they are about serious subjects. And frequently, I've gone to other conferences, spoken about my book, but I've seldom seen an audience as serious about learning as this one is. So I'm grateful to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Most economists will say that regulation of any business adds costs, and that additional cost reduces productivity, it reduces efficiency. Regulation is also beneficial to business, and it can also be beneficial to business and detrimental to consumers by increasing the costs of entry to a market and reducing competition. This often increases prices. On the other hand, regulation can benefit consumers by assuring through licensing a certain level of quality in products or services that might not otherwise be achieved, but this also can result in freezing innovation and maintaining unsatisfactory status quo into the future. So there are several cross-cutting benefits and detriments to regulation and have to be taken into account in any assessment of the government's intervention in the economy. The problem is that there are seldom any reliable numbers attached to these benefits and detriments, making it difficult to weigh one against another. Cost-benefit analysis is thus still in a rather primitive state. We know it would be useful, but even at the level of individual regulations, we are frequently unable to make a persuasive case, at least a data-based case, one way or the other. The same is true in evaluating a regulatory structure as pervasive as the Dodd-Frank Act. This gigantic law, clearly the most significant and costly regulation of the financial system since the New Deal, must be imposing some very substantial costs on our economy. Are these costs balanced by commensurate benefits? Proponents argue, for example, that without Dodd-Frank, we would be plunged into a new financial crisis. This is the argument that's advanced by Senator Elizabeth Warren, and judging from the coverage that she gets in the media for these alarming statements, a large number of people must find these assertions to be credible. Others have argued that the financial crisis was not caused by a lack of regulation, but rather by the government's housing policies. These policies caused the collapse of an enormous asset class, and that is residential mortgages, about $11 trillion, and thus seriously weakened the financial firms that held these instruments as investments. This is what that book is about, Hidden in Plain Sight, which Gary just mentioned. If this is correct, Dodd-Frank, which had almost nothing to say about housing policy, cannot be credited with preventing another financial crisis when, in fact, it didn't address the causes of the last one. Indeed, I argued that myself in a piece published by the Hillsdale College, this was an imprimis, in December of 2013. Still, the Warren position at bottom would be that no one has been able to show that the Dodd-Frank Act has done any particular harm, and therefore it would be risky to repeal the law when its provisions could prevent another crisis. Thus, it may be difficult to prove through traditional cost-benefit analysis that Dodd-Frank as a whole has been costly to the economy, or that it has been beneficial. After all, whatever the costs, if the law really were to prevent another crisis, that would be worth a lot. However, it may be possible to show that there has been one substantial cost of Dodd-Frank, so that reasonable people can at least consider whether the law is worth keeping. I hope the paper I'm preparing for this conference will at least make a start in showing that the possible but unproven benefits of Dodd-Frank have to be weighed against the possibility that the law has caused an historically slow recovery for the financial crisis, from the financial crisis and for our economy. And that if the Dodd-Frank Act is kept in place for the future, the U.S. economy will continue to perform much less well than it has in the past. Dodd-Frank became law on July 21, 2010. And it's important to keep this date in mind because it is the after effects of the law that are of interest. The chart on the screen that I hope will be up there momentarily, let's see if we can do that. I always have problems with technology. It's my age. The chart on the screen was prepared by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and shows the quarter-by-quarter growth of the U.S. economy before the crisis and into the second quarter of 2013. The gray area is the range, and the black line is the average of prior cycles. The lines in the chart could be extended through 2015 without any substantial change. The chart shows that the current recovery is far below the range and average of these prior periods. Now, correlation is not causation. So the question is whether there is a plausible causal connection between Dodd-Frank and the slow recovery from the financial crisis. If so, of course, that would be a very strong argument against this very pervasive law. Now, this is a difficult task because there is simply no data on the overall cost of Dodd-Frank. So we have to go at it, I think, in another way. First, there is the question whether a recession caused by a financial crisis normally results in a slower recovery. This idea was advanced, as many of you probably know, in a book called This Time is Different by Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff that received a great deal of very favorable attention just after the financial crisis. However, a later study by scholars Michael Bordeaux and Joseph Haubrich has shown that recoveries after financial crises are actually sharper than other recoveries. After studying 27 U.S. recession recovery cycles since 1882, they concluded that, quote, the stylized fact that deep contractions breed strong recoveries is particularly true when there is a financial crisis. So we should have expected a steep recovery after the sharp 2008-2009 recession, rather than the stuttering and stalling recovery we have seen since then. Bordo and Halbrick find only 3 exceptions to this pattern. In these cycles, the recoveries did not match the speed of the downturns. The 3 were the Depression in the 1930s, the 1990 recession that ended in March 1991, and the most recent recession, which ended in June 2009. Now, what do these 3 exceptions have in common? In each case, the government's intervention in the financial system was unusual and extensive. During the Depression, Hoover and Roosevelt tried many ways to arrest the slide in the economy, all without success. Hoover was an inveterate activist in all things, and Franklin Roosevelt believed in constant experimentation until something worked. Under President Hoover, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, the Emergency Relief and Reconstruction Act, and established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, among other things. Under Roosevelt, well, we could all name all of them, but I'll mention a few of the things that were done, and that is the U.S. went off the gold standard, established a deposit insurance system, and a new federal regulatory system for state-chartered banks. Congress adopted the National Recovery Act, the Emergency Banking Act, the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, and the Securities Act, also, among others. This enormous flurry of activity, however, while popular with the American people, did not produce the meaningful or prolonged recovery until the nation geared up for war at the end of the 1930s. In addition, the Pecora hearings of the early Roosevelt administration propagated the idea that banks' securities activities had caused the crisis. This is uncannily similar to the false narrative that produced the Dodd-Frank Act, which blamed the financial crisis on insufficient regulation of the financial system and greed and recklessness on Wall Street. The Pecora hearings resulted in the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated securities and banking activities. Now, whether that was harmful in itself can be debated, but the wholesale revision of financial structures it entailed probably constricted credit and market confidence quite a bit in the years that followed. The recession in 1990 and 1991 came after the collapse of the S&L industry, another great government failure, in the late 1980s, and the failure of almost 1,600 banks at that time. Both were blamed on insufficient regulatory authority or lax enforcement. Again, like the narratives that supported the Dodd-Frank Act and produced 2 major banking rules, the Financial Institutions Recovery, Reform, and Enforcement Act of 1989, and then the FDICIA, that is the FDIC Improvement Act in 1991. Both were claimed to be sufficient to end all banking crises after that. These laws increased regulatory authority for the federal bank regulators, and under pressure by Congress and the public, these bank regulators cracked down on depository institutions, causing a credit crunch, which was called a jobless recovery in 1991. Thus, there is historical basis that the slow recovery from the 2008 financial crisis is due in part, maybe primarily, to the fact that the Dodd-Frank Act was adopted shortly after the crisis. Instead of allowing the economy and the financial system to heal naturally, it introduced constraints, costs, and uncertainties that have interfered with the natural course of a recovery. Moreover, like the Pecora hearings, Dodd-Frank was based on the idea that the private sector was to blame for the crisis and thus sought to punish the very entities that were necessary to finance a recovery. Now, this history, while important, is not enough to make a case against Dodd-Frank. So let's start with this. Studies of the effect of Dodd-Frank have shown that the regulatory burdens it imposes on small banks have been particularly harsh for those banks. and will define them as banks with, these are called community banks, and those are defined by the federal government, by the Federal Reserve, as banks with $10 billion of assets or less. Now, 98.5% of all U.S. banks fall into this category. A 2012 Government Accountability Office study showed that 7 of the 16 titles of Dodd-Frank had potential adverse effects on these banks. And studies by scholars at George Mason University and Harvard's Kennedy School have found significant compliance cost increases attributable to the Dodd-Frank law. Quote, since the second quarter of 2010, said the Harvard study, around the time of the Dodd-Frank passage, we found community banks' share of U.S. banking assets had shrunk drastically, over 12%. Of course, the regulatory costs to community banks are not a new story. Congress has been attempting, for a period of time, to mitigate these costs. What is new is the idea that I'll explore here, that these additional regulatory costs on small banks have had an adverse effect on small business and hence on U.S. economic growth. We are dealing here with a part of the U.S. economy that does not get a lot of attention in the media, so some numbers are in order. According to the Small Business Administration, a small business is one that has fewer than 500 employees. There were approximately 23 million small businesses in the United States in 2012, of which approximately 5 million were employers, amounting to over 99% of all employer firms. The rest are sole proprietorships, we call them moms and pops, that have no formal employees. In contrast, again according to the SBA, there were 18,500 firms in 2010, that is less than 1% of all firms, that had more than 500 employees and thus were not counted as small firms. What is interesting for our purposes is that these two classes of business, large and small, have different ways of getting financing. There were approximately 10,000 firms registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2014. Virtually all of these businesses had more than 500 employees. Registration with the SEC means that these firms have access to financing in the capital markets, which have been largely unaffected so far by Dodd-Frank. But small businesses, almost 23 million small firms, including 5 million small employers, do not register with the SEC and hence do not have access to the capital markets. They are required to rely primarily on banks for their credit needs. Accordingly, we have a peculiarly bifurcated economy, with the vast majority of employers needing banks for financing, while a small number of large firms has access to credit in the capital markets because they are large enough to register with the SEC and finance themselves through the issuance of bonds, notes, and commercial paper. This is where the costs loaded on small banks may begin to affect the U.S. economy. Regulatory costs affect small banks much more than large banks because the costs are largely fixed, but the large banks have much more assets over which to spread those costs. When a small bank is required to hire a compliance officer, that is an employee who is not making loans or producing revenue. When the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, set up by Dodd-Frank, sends out a 1,099-page regulation on mortgage lending, that means a community bank must engage a lawyer to interpret the new regulation, a compliance officer to apply the regulation in individual cases, and a tech firm to retool its mortgage underwriting system. All costs, no revenue, fewer funds to lend. When a bank examiner criticizes a loan because the bank does not have audited financial statements for a customer that has never missed a payment in 20 years, that forces the bank to revise its business model and change its customer relationships. And again, costs for the bank, less financing for small business. If it is correct that the costs Dodd-Frank has imposed on small banks are having an adverse effect on small business, we should see a significant difference between the growth rates of small and large businesses since 2010. That's exactly what the data shows. In a Goldman Sachs report published in April 2015 entitled The Two-Speed Economy, using IRS data, the Goldman study found that large firms, that is, those with $50 million or more in revenue, that is annual revenue, have been growing revenue at a compounded rate of approximately 8%, while firms with less than $50 million in revenue have been growing revenue at an average of only 2% compounded annually, roughly the rate of inflation. Even more significant, using census data, the Goldman authors found that firms with more than 500 employees, that's large firms according to the SBA, grew by roughly 42,000 employees per month between 2010 and 2012, exceeding the best historical performance over the past 4 recoveries. In contrast, jobs at firms with fewer than 500 employees, again, community banks, community firms, smaller employers, small businesses, declined by nearly 700 employees per month over the same time frame. Although these firms had grown by roughly 54,000 employees a month on average over the prior 4 recoveries. Here, then, is a possible source of the slow recovery from the 2008-2009 recession. Although 64% of net new jobs in the U.S. economy between 2002 and 2010 came from employment by small business, this source of growth has virtually disappeared since the enactment of Dodd-Frank. Lending to small business has been growing, but slowly. And that could be because the businesses themselves have been growing slowly. In other words, rather than a cause of slow, small business growth, reduced bank lending could simply be an effect. We don't really know. The data is weak. Nevertheless, the inquiry is worth doing. The recovery has been extraordinarily slow. We don't really know why. But Dodd-Frank's heavy regulation could be the answer. Thanks very much.
Well, again, another excellent presentation. Our next speaker is Randal O'Toole, and he is the senior fellow at the Cato Institute, which is another fine organization that if you're professors out there and you're looking for help in explaining to your students how markets work, both AEI and Cato are good places to look for that. He's worked on urban growth, public land, and transportation issues. His research on national forest management, culminating in his 1988 book, Reforming the Forest Service, has had a major influence on the Forest Service policy and on-the-ground management. His latest book is American Nightmare, How Government Undermines the Dream of Home Ownership. He's the author of numerous Cato papers, as well as op-eds and articles for national journals and newspapers. As an Oregon native, he was educated in forestry at Oregon State University and in economics at the University of Oregon. He has taught at Yale, Berkeley, and Utah State. Please help me welcome Randal O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Gary. This is like Peter, this is my first time at a Hillsdale Free Market Forum. And as Gary mentioned, I taught at a college in New Haven and a college in Berkeley. But now that I can put Hillsdale on my resume, I can say I've finally arrived. I was asked to talk about the environmental regulation, and I'm going to talk about a particular kind of environmental regulation for two reasons. First of all, it's the kind I know best, which is land use regulation. And second of all, I think it's the kind of regulation that has done an enormous amount of damage to our economy and to our country. The kind of regulation I'm talking about is sometimes called growth management. You might hear the term smart growth, a lot of other terms, sustainable growth, a lot of other terms are used for it, but growth management is the all-encompassing term. Let me give you an example from my home state of Oregon. In 1979, the state decided that every single city in the state should have an urban growth boundary around the city. All the urban growth boundaries of all the cities in Oregon add up to 1.25% of the land in the state. Almost all the other land in the state is zoned rural. In rural land in Oregon, you can build a house on your land if you own 80 acres, you actually farm it, and you actually earn, depending on soil productivity, $40,000 to $80,000 a year farming it. And the planners are very proud that because of these rules, they only have to issue about 100 building permits a year outside of urban growth boundaries. Meanwhile, inside the urban growth boundaries, in order to avoid expanding the boundaries, they're rezoning lands to higher densities. That means they're going into single neighborhoods to single-family homes and rezoning them for apartments. The city of Portland has set a target of reducing the percentage of people living in single-family homes from 65% to 41%. They think more people should live in apartments. And they're not exclusively devoted to apartments. They don't mind building more single-family homes. Here's what they call a tiny home, a 500 square foot single-family home that was built next to the driveway of another house in the neighborhood in which I grew up in Portland. So the planners have become very intrusive. Planners in Oregon are so intrusive that they once told this church that it would be allowed to have no more than 70 people worship at one time in its 400-seat sanctuary because it would cause too much traffic congestion to fill up the sanctuary. So I guess we're all supposed to worship at whatever church or temple or synagogue or mosque that happens to be within walking distance of our home, not the one that we happen to be a member of. Now that's Oregon. Oregon actually didn't pioneer these kinds of rules. They started in Hawaii, and then California in 1963 passed a law that governed annexations. It created what are called local area formation commissions. Now, if you're from California and you know housing prices are really high, you may never have heard of the local area formation commissions, but they're the reason why housing prices are high. They've all drawn urban growth boundaries, and they can't change the boundaries without spending millions and millions of dollars on environmental impact reports, which none of the cities are willing to do. Here's the urban growth boundary for San Jose. You can see on the left side of this picture are houses. The right side is pretty crummy pasture land, range land, but they don't dare expand the boundary because they don't want to use up farmland. So because of that, San Jose has very, very expensive housing. Statewide, California has the most concentrated populations in the country. 95% of the people are confined to about 5% of the land in the state. It's almost impossible to build outside of these urban growth boundaries, and so only 5% live on the other 95%. Here, this is the San Francisco Bay Area. If you've been to San Francisco, it may look like it's all urbanized. In fact, only about 16% of the San Francisco Bay Area has been urbanized. About 20% is in parks, and the other 64% is private land that can't be developed. The private landowners have lost their rights to do any development. The plans for the area call to put all new development in about 5% of the areas you see here that are red, in high-density developments. Again, putting people in apartments rather than single-family homes. Now, we have something called the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution that supposedly protects property rights. How do states like Oregon and Washington and California and Hawaii and a number of other states get away with intruding on people's property rights and saying, you can't develop your land, you have to build apartments, you have to do whatever, when we have the Fifth Amendment? Well, it turns out that the Supreme Court has successively diminished the First Amendment in a number of decisions. One of the earliest was in 1926 in Euclid, which is a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. The city had zoned land for residential, and one of the owners of the land wanted to use their land for industrial, and so they took it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, because they had written a general plan, the Constitution doesn't apply anymore. And to put it into an industry next to a house would be a nuisance, and so just creates too much disorder and danger, so we have to have a plan, and so zoning is okay. Well, you know, we could sort of go along with that. You don't want an industry next to your house. You don't want a gravel pit next to your house and so on. But then in 1978, the Supreme Court issued a new ruling. Penn Central had Grand Central Station, and they wanted to build a skyscraper on top of it. The station was originally designed to have a skyscraper built on top of it, but they never finished it. Now they wanted to build it, and the city said, no, that's a historic building. You can't do it. There's no nuisances involved. We've just decided we like your building the way it is, and so we're going to make you pay the cost of not getting to expand it. And so they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, because there's a comprehensive plan to preserve historic structures, the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply. You don't have to compensate anybody for taking people's rights away, taking people's property away, as long as there's a plan. So now every city in the country has urban planners on their staffs, because if they write a plan, then the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply anymore. And this happened again. You've all heard of the Kelo decision. This is Suzette Kelo, whose house was in a working class neighborhood in the city of New London, Connecticut. And the city decided, we will make more property taxes if we tear down her house and have some developer put up an upper middle income house. And that person will pay, the owner of that house will pay more property taxes, and we'll get more revenue, and so that's a public benefit. Now, under the Constitution, you can only take land for public use. And the Supreme Court said, well, since they're getting more taxes out of it, that's the public use they're getting. So it's okay. Of course, they compensated Suzette Kelo, but it's okay because they wrote an economic development plan. So, and of course, this is Suzette Kelo's house now. It's been turned into a dump because the developer who wanted to put in the upper middle class homes changed their mind, and they never got developed. And so now they're getting no property taxes out of it. That's how well planning works. That's why I'm called the anti-planner. So the Supreme Court has redefined the Fifth Amendment to mean that private property can be taken for public use through regulation without compensation, or for private use with compensation. It's totally turning upside down the Fifth Amendment. And states like Oregon and California and Hawaii have run with that and changed things. It's called the Quiet Revolution. We've overturned property rights in this country. One state that hasn't done it is Texas. Texas does not allow counties to zone land. I think it's the only state that doesn't allow counties. There are some states that allow counties but don't mandate it, and so Nevada and Indiana and a number of other states have some counties that zone and some counties that don't zone. Texas doesn't allow counties to zone. Of course, Houston famously has no zoning, but Dallas and Austin and San Antonio do, but for the most part, they don't try to be very restrictive because they know developers can leave the city and do whatever they want. Typically, the developers in Texas will buy 5,000 acres of land and subdivide it into lots and leave parks and have recreation areas and have commercial areas and school areas, and then sell the lots and pay for it that way. And the housing is very inexpensive. Now, if you're from Omaha, Texas housing prices won't surprise you. If you're from the coast, they will. This is a 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath, 2,400 square foot house. It sold for $160,000. That's what a house should sell for, but on the coast, it's not going to sell for anything like that because on the coast, we have all this growth management. This particular development has lots of parklands. I went there and I just fell in love. I like the mountains, but if ever I get tired of the mountains, I might be interested in moving to Houston or live in someplace like this. Coldwell Banker every year publishes an index of how much houses cost. A standard house, 2,200 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, etc., in cities all over the country. And we can look and see Omaha, that house would cost about $200,000 or about $91 a square foot in 2014. Houston, about $109 a square foot. Portland, $190 a square foot, almost twice as much as Omaha. San Jose, $350 a square foot, and this is in 2014. If we went back to 2006, it would have been $600 a square foot, just a huge amount. That difference is entirely due to planning. This is the cost of planning. It has nothing to do with demand or anything else. Back in 1969, San Jose was the fastest growing urban area in the United States. It had grown faster than any other urban area for more than 2 decades, and yet housing prices in San Jose were just about as affordable as anywhere else in the country because they didn't have any planners restricting development. Today, the typical house in San Jose costs more than 6 times as much median family incomes. It should be twice as much. We can go back and see they were about twice as much in 1969. Whoops. Uh-oh. Hit the blank slide. How do I get... There we go. So now we're back almost 7 times in San Jose, almost 8 times in Los Angeles, 4 times in Portland. Houston and Omaha, though, are still about twice median family income. So housing is still affordable in the middle states, but it's very unaffordable in the coastal states because of this planning. The planners actually admit their goal is to attract wealthy people. And one of the effects of this is that you create, as urban economist Edward Glaser says, you create elite cities for a few people. But it also, that means it has severe negative impacts for minorities and low-income people, or low-income minorities. We look at blacks, for example, and if you measure it solely on population change, the most racist city in America is San Francisco, because San Francisco had the greatest decline in black population compared to the growth in overall population of any city or urban area. Looking at it either from a city viewpoint or an urban area viewpoint, San Francisco has had the greatest impact on black populations. Californian blacks are moving out. That's one of the reasons why the black population in Portland has grown a little bit faster than the overall population, is because so many are moving from California where they can't afford to live anymore. But Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, places like that, black populations are growing faster because they can afford to live there. These cities offer opportunities that the other cities don't offer. Another big cost of all of this restriction is that you get more, not just higher cost housing, but more volatile housing prices. That's because where you don't have land use regulation, you have essentially an unlimited supply of land. There's not a single state, not even Hawaii, that is short of land for residential purposes, for urban purposes. Hawaii, all the urban areas only occupy about 15% of the state. New Jersey is 35%. It's more than any other state. Most states, it's about 2 or 3%. So there's a lot of land out there. Labor costs about the same. Because of cheap transportation, materials cost about the same. So that means the supply curve for housing is effectively horizontal. An increase in demand doesn't lead to an increase in price. A decrease in demand doesn't lead to a decrease in the price for new homes. When you start restricting supply, when you create urban growth boundaries and you limit the amount of land available for development, you steepen that supply curve. So a small increase in demand translates into a large increase in price. And conversely, a small decrease in demand translates into a large decrease in price. And then you get housing bubbles. You get these huge rises in price and then these huge collapses, which we got in the last boom in the mid-2000s. The bubble peaked in about 2006 in almost every major city in the country that had this land use growth management regulation. In the places that didn't have it, places like Houston and Omaha and Atlanta, this is what housing prices looked like. It wasn't really a bubble, and the only reason why you're seeing a decline, you notice it peaks at about 2008 after the peak everywhere else. After the financial crisis, if you didn't have the financial crisis, you wouldn't have had a decline. And if we didn't have growth management in these other communities, we wouldn't have had a financial crisis. If every place, including San Jose and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Miami and so on, if housing prices looked like this, there would have been no financial crisis. So I like to say that urban planners caused the housing bubble that caused the financial crisis. Right now, about 15 states have passed growth management laws, and there's a pretty close correlation between which states passed the laws and which states had housing bubbles. About 45% of housing was under these kind of restrictions and had a housing bubble in the 2000s. And this is something that nobody had expected. Nobody except for the few people like me who are looking at land use issues, but nobody in the housing markets, the mortgage markets, the realtor markets, they weren't expecting this at all. The National Association of Realtors had economists who were saying, oh, it's no bubble, housing prices are just going up like they always do. And the mortgage companies were packaging their loans and so on, and they assumed that housing prices would go up, so it's okay to sell to a subprime borrower, because if they go bankrupt, well, they'll just take the house and sell it to somebody else. It's going to be more valuable than it is today, so you won't lose any money. And because of that volatility that they didn't expect, it led to the financial crisis. Specifically, companies like these either made mortgages or packaged mortgage bonds. And when they did so, they had a reserve requirement. They had to have so much cash reserves for their bonds, for their mortgages. But the cash reserves depended on the quality of the investment. If it was a low-risk investment, they didn't have to have much of a cash reserve. If it was a high-risk investment, they had to have a huge cash reserve. Well, these are the ratings agencies. They looked at the mortgage bonds and they said, well, housing prices aren't volatile, and so it's a low-risk investment. So they gave all the bonds AAA ratings. And then in 2006, housing prices started to decline, and they said, oh, they're more volatile than we thought. So they went back and they re-rated those bonds, and so suddenly these companies, which had all these bonds, are having to come up with billions of dollars in reserve requirements that they don't have. That's why Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. They didn't have the money. They needed to meet their reserve requirements. It wasn't people defaulting on their loans that caused the financial crisis. It was the re-rating of the bonds that increased the reserve requirements, that put Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and Washington Mutual out of business, and would have put Citibank out of business if we hadn't rescued them, which we shouldn't have done. Now, you'll be glad to know that none of those states have changed their laws. Florida changed its law, but they said the previous law mandated growth management planning. Now it's just optional. And when they changed the law, they said it's optional, and every city kept their growth management plan. So all those plans are still in place. So guess what? We're having another housing bubble. You can look forward to another crisis. But hopefully the ratings agencies understand that these prices are a lot more volatile. It won't translate into a worldwide financial crisis like the last one did. Now, shameless self-promotion. I wrote this all up in a book called American Nightmare. There's probably one of about 500 books out there about what caused the financial crisis. This is the one that's right. All the others are wrong. You can buy this on Kindle or buy an EPUB version for $13. The hard copy is $25. I have a few copies with me. If you buy the Kindle version, it won't come with my free autograph. I'm selling them for $20. If you don't want to pay for it, you can download this paper, How Urban Planners Caused a Housing Bubble, which is one small part of the book from the Cato Institute's website, cato.org. I also want to mention, since I still have a minute available, that every year for the last 10 years, I've been holding a national conference on these kinds of issues and also on related transportation issues. It's called the American Dream Conference. This year it's going to be in Austin, Texas. In 3 weeks, November 6 to 8, and we're going to have people from all over the country talking about these kinds of issues, and we're going to actually talk about how we can use recent Supreme Court decisions to dismantle these growth management laws and prevent these kinds of problems from ever happening again in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, again, another excellent presentation. Our next speaker is going to speak on the effects of regulatory uncertainty. Stephen Davis, he's an applied economist who studied employment and wage behavior, worker mobility, job loss, the effects of labor market institutions, business dynamics, industrial organization, economic fluctuations, national economic performance, public policy, and other topics. And he's only 30 years old, right? He's former editor of the American Economic Journal, Macroeconomics. He's also a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research, economic advisor to the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and a non-resident visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He earned his PhD in economics from Brown University, and he is the William Abbott Professor of International Business and Economics at the University of Chicago. We talked a little bit yesterday about how strange it was to go from Brown to University of Chicago, matched only by my going from Berkeley to Hillsdale. So with that, can we have welcome for Stephen Davis.
Thanks for that, Randy. Or not Randy. I'm gonna say something about Randy in a minute. Thanks for that, Gary. It's a real pleasure to be here, to have a chance to address this audience and share the stage with my panelists. I got the first slide up, great. So I'm going to talk about regulatory uncertainty and complexity. I like to organize my remarks around three principles for policymakers that I borrowed shamelessly from George Shultz. So this is from a recent essay he wrote. There's many good principles, worthy principles for policymakers. In his essay, I'm going to take just these three. And so here they are. Keep the regulatory system simple, clear, simple, and easy to administer. That's what Randy was talking about, right? Clear, simple, and then live with it. Keep the tax system as simple as possible, and make economic policies predictable. So I want to start by taking a quick look at the current U.S. situation in relationship to these principles. And I'm going to show you some evidence pertaining to each one. I'm sure you have some sense of what the picture looks like, but I want to put the current situation in a broad historical perspective. Let me start with regulation, in particular the scale of federal regulation. So there's something called the Code of Federal Regulations. This is an annual publication the federal government puts together, and the purpose of which is very simple. It's just to collect all of the federal regulations that are in place in each given year. Okay, and with the beauties of modern computers, you can write a little computer program to count how many pages there are in the digital versions of this Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. That's what's done here. So you can see that back to 1949, there's been roughly an 8-fold increase in just the number of words and pages it takes to describe the federal regulations in place. Now, by the end of this period, it's about 175,000 pages long. That's just to describe the current regulatory structure. It's hard to wrap your head around something of that scale. So let me put it in terms that might be familiar. 170,000 pages, that's equivalent to 130 copies of the King James Bible. Okay, so that's the scale of the federal regulatory structure, just to describe the regulations. Or sticking with the biblical theme, you can write a computer program that counts every instance of must, may not, should, provided, required, those kinds of words. Commandments, let's call them commandments, okay? So, there were, I think, 10 commandments, that was enough for the God of the Old Testament. There's more than 1 million commandments in the form that I just described in the current Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, so that's just to give you some sense of the scale. We've heard about land use regulation, mostly at the state and local level, and then we heard about financial regulation, which mostly happens at the federal level. Now, if you look at this chart, you'll notice something else which is quite interesting, and that is that the regulatory leviathan that we have now is a bipartisan creation. The regulatory system, as measured this way, has tended to expand during both Republican and Democratic presidencies. There are a few short-lived exceptions to kind of this general pattern of expansion. You can see one in the first term of Ronald Reagan. You can see one in the first term of Bill Clinton. But basically, the scale of the federal regulatory system is expanded, whether there's Republicans or Democrats in power. That's an important observation. It carries the corollary that something more than just throw one set of bums out and elect another set of bums is going to solve the problem. Now, this is just the federal level. We heard something from Randy. Randy, by the way, I grew up in Portland, and I'm currently on leave from my university, living not too far from San Jose. So what you had to say resonated with me. But let me pick up on another topic, another aspect of state and local regulation. I'm not going to try to summarize state and local regulation. I don't really know how to do it in such a succinct way. But we heard last night from Jason Riley, and we heard again today about occupational licensing. So let me take that as my example to go along with the expansion of land use regulation that we heard about earlier. If you go back to the 1950s, fewer than 5% of workers were in jobs where they had to have a government-mandated license in order to lawfully perform their jobs. By 2008, it was up to 29%. Okay? Now, these occupational licensing restrictions are mostly a state and local phenomenon. Okay? So that's just an indication that this expansion you see at the federal level has also occurred at the state and local level. Now, you can make a good case for occupational licensing for some occupations, maybe physicians and dentists and so on. But if you look at the vast majority of these things, they're things like barbers and manicurists and tree trimmers and auctioneers and sign language interpreters and cosmetologists and hair braiders. I think that was the example Jason Riley gave last night. So again, these are government rules that are basically saying unless you pass through these hoops, and they're often quite onerous, you cannot lawfully work in this activity. Okay, so that's a phenomenon at the state and local level. Now, what about the tax code? Well, then I'm just going to talk about the federal tax code. It's only 70,000 pages of instructions to describe the tax code. It's got about 4 million words, 67,000 sections, subsections, and cross-references. And I'm sure if you read the instructions carefully, it's all perfectly clear. But you'd have to read them every year, because the tax code changes every year. There are hundreds of changes to just the federal tax code every year, as I've indicated there on the slide. Now, maybe the most important bullet point on this slide is the last one. Estimated 2015 tax expenditures, and this comes from government sources. This is not some outside crazy right-wing source trying to make things look worse than they are. Estimated tax expenditures in 2014 were $1.4 trillion. Tax expenditures are basically tax breaks in the income tax system to support some worthy idea or cause or group or something like that. To put that in comparison, direct federal spending in 2014 was $3.5 trillion. So the point of this observation is that we have fallen into a practice of using the tax system as another major instrument of regulation. And I think that's one of the major reasons why the tax code is so complex. I'll come back to that point towards the end of my remarks. Now, let me see if I can back up here. So here are the principles that I took from George Shultz. We've kind of shown you a little bit of evidence on the first two. It's pretty clear from what I've shown you and from what you've heard from Peter and Randy that we're not doing a very good job adhering to those principles. In fact, if I were giving a grade, we'd clearly get an F. What about the third one? That's a little harder to assess in a quantitative way, but along with Nick Bloom and Scott Baker, I've been trying to do that in recent years. That is to measure the predictability or the uncertainty associated with economic policy making. Let me tell you the basic idea of how we do it. So again, using the power of modern computers and digital archives of newspapers, you can instruct a computer to read every single newspaper article that was, say, published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Dallas Morning Herald, whatever. And you can say, well, pick out all the articles that talk about topic X. Okay? So what I've done here is taken 6 major newspapers and quantified all of the articles that talk about policy-related economic uncertainty. How do I do that in practice? Well, I write a computer program that says an article's got to be talking about the economy, so it's got to contain a word like economics or the economy. It's got to be talking about uncertainty, and it's got to be talking about policy. And I count the number of articles that do that, and I scale it by the number of all articles in the newspaper on average across newspapers. How do we determine the criteria? That part took a lot of work. Basically, I had teams of undergraduate students who, along with me, we read 15,000 randomly selected newspaper articles over the last century or so. And after they went through a training process, they coded them up. This is what the article's about. And those randomly selected articles then served as a target. And so I'd go to the computer again and I'd say, okay, let's try different sets of criteria, and let's find a set of criteria that gets as close as possible to replicating what my intelligent, well-trained, extremely attentive University of Chicago undergraduate students determined from the article. That's basically the methodology, and then once you've done that kind of time-intensive part, you can roll it out. So this is what comes out of it. This is the newspaper-based index of economic policy uncertainty, and you can see that it's gone up a lot, basically since the mid-1960s, by about a factor of 5. Now, I'm not going to dwell on why that's happened today. I've written about that topic, but I just want to take that as an indication that there is, at least as perceived by newspaper journalists and presumably their readers, there's a sense that there's more uncertainty-related economic policy today than there was in decades past. One of the nice things about this newspaper-based approach is you can drill down further and you can pick a particular area of policy. I'm going to talk about healthcare policy uncertainty right here, and say, okay, among these articles that meet these criteria for economic policy uncertainty, how many of them are talking about healthcare policy issues in particular? And again, I would add additional terms like the Affordable Care Act and so on, or Medicare. So here's what comes out of that approach. Okay, so this is an attempt to quantify the extent of concerns that are being expressed in newspapers about uncertainty over the health care. And you can see there are 3 big episodes that stand out here. There's the first Clinton healthcare reform initiative, which you'll remember failed. There was Bush's announcement of Medicare reform, which eventually led to the Medicaid Act, the Prescription Drug Act of 2003, which was a big deal at the time. And then there's the Affordable Care Act. Okay, and you can see that in the several years, basically from 2009 through 2013 or so, the extent of uncertainty about healthcare policy in the United States was 5 or 6 times as large, or at least up to 5 times as large as it had been on average over this period. And there were many factors that entered into that. There were the initial legislative battles. There were the electoral battles in 2010. There were the multiple constitutional challenges, which I won't rehearse for you, but you'll recall they really involved a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And then there were the implementation snafus associated particularly with the rollout of the exchanges. So this is a piece of evidence kind of drilling down, what's underneath this rising policy uncertainty. Here's the same type of exercise, but now with respect to financial regulation uncertainty. And this dovetails well with what Peter said. This is a busier chart, but if you look in this chart, you can see that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that period stands out as one of intense uncertainty. So does the Dodd-Frank Act, its passage. The Obama-Romney election stands out because those 2 candidates had very different ideas about how the financial system should be regulated. And at least for a while, the election was a close call. And then there's not surprisingly a lot of stuff around the financial crisis. So that's just going to give you some sense of what underlies these increased concerns among people about policy uncertainty. Now here's a very different approach. This has nothing to do with newspaper articles. Instead, what I've done here is taken data from the Congressional Budget Office, which, in order to carry out its mission, has to understand future changes that are in the tax code that have already been legislated but not yet implemented. And these typically involve provisions of the tax code that are set to expire at some future date, but everybody knows that they're probably not going to expire. They're really just an occasion to have a political battle about what to do. So the fiscal cliff is the most dramatic example of this in recent years, but if you recall back in 2010, there was a big fight over the extension of the so-called Bush tax cuts. Now what this chart shows you, that's a fairly recent phenomenon in the United States. It's only since the early 2000s where we've begun to manufacture instability and uncertainty in the tax code in a way where in December you don't know what your tax rate will be starting the next January. You know, we're at least since the fiscal cliff resolution, that's been dramatically diminished, but that's a new phenomenon that's occurred in the U.S. policy landscape that added to policy uncertainty. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the costs of this. There are many, many studies that try to assess the costs of government regulation, the cost of the complexity of the tax code. It's hard to come up with an overall assessment. The numbers typically range for the cost of regulation, maybe a few $100 billion a year, maybe $2 trillion a year. Some numbers are larger. The tax code, again, it's hard to come up with a quantitative number. These are big, but there's no doubt these costs are large. This chart just draws your attention to one other fact that I think is important in this regard, and then I suspect will be of interest to many in this economy. And that's the tremendous decline in various indicators of business dynamism in the United States economy over the past 35 years. I've picked just one here. This is the share of private sector employment accounted for by businesses that are less than 5 years old, so new and young businesses. And less than 5 years old here means it's been less than 60 months since you had your first paid employee. If you look at this chart, you can see that it was almost 18% in 1981, and it fell by more than half by 2012 to a little bit more than 8%. So that's a dramatic shift away from not just IPO firms. This is all young firms, okay? So what does it have to do with the regulation of the tax system? Well, as we heard earlier, there are fixed cost components of compliance with the regulatory system, with those 1 million commandments that I told you about, with the 70,000 pages of tax code. New, young, and small businesses tend to be disadvantaged by these large compliance costs because they have to hire lawyers or specialists or use senior management time to figure them out. So I don't want to suggest that the regulatory system and the tax system are the only factors that are pushing down business dynamism as indicated in this chart, but there's good reason to think, both in economic theory and in evidence, that it is a factor, and so it's constricting the formation of new businesses. Now, so back on Schultz's third prescription, make economic policies predictable. We've been doing a pretty lousy job on that one as well in recent years. Now, this is a large and complex problem, the regulatory complexity and scale, the tax code complexity and scale. There's no magic bullet to solve these problems, but I do think there's some principles that would improve the situation, and I want to just very quickly in my remaining time go through some of them. First, when you think about the design of regulation and policy, the trade-off between goals and complexity should be kept in mind. There's a lot of talk about global warming and the increased carbon in the atmosphere. Set aside your views about whether or not you think we ought to do anything about that as a matter of policy, and just take it as given for the sake of argument that you think the government should do something to address the global warming that is in part associated with carbon emissions. The question is, how do you do that? You can do it in a command and control fashion where you implement thousands and thousands of regulations in order to tell businesses and households how to conduct their affairs. That's the approach we've taken. Another approach, an approach many economists think is better because it's simpler, is to have a carbon tax system. So if you want to understand what the economic rationale is for a carbon tax, part of it is to have a simpler regulatory approach rather than the one that we've adopted. Similar arguments apply to capital requirements on financial institutions. Most economists think there ought to be some way to regulate financial institutions to ensure we don't have a financial crisis. Do you want to do it in a command and control, detailed manner, or do you want to make banks safer Capital requirements is an effort to make them safer and to lessen the need for complex regulations. So I'm going to just say a bit about the personal tax system and then conclude. So as I pointed out earlier, one of the reasons the tax system is so complex is that we've come to use it as another instrument of regulation. I think we need to abandon that idea and think about the tax code as a vehicle for raising revenues in the least distorting manner that we can, with some allowance for progressivity. Now that means getting rid of deductions. That means a generous personal exemption so that low-income people don't own any income tax. That would lead to a vastly simpler tax system than the one we have now. There are many different routes to improve upon the current tax system, partly because it's so bad. You heard Art Laffer talk about a particular version of the flat tax. That's an example that goes in this direction. I think I'm just about out of time, so I'll skip over abolishing the corporate income tax and just say, for goodness sake, let's stop manufacturing uncertainty in the tax system through fiscal cliffs. Let's stop having debt ceiling fights that are resolved at the last minute and that create tremendous turmoil in financial markets. Thanks very much.
Well, we do have time for some questions. We'll probably go about 15 minutes beyond what we had scheduled before. And so if you wait for the microphone, we have a microphone coming. One on this side, and there'll be one on that side.
Attribute the housing crisis essentially to the ratings agencies, the bond ratings agencies, and the problems there with respect to reserves. Of course, there are other explanations of the housing crisis and related financial crisis out there. Federal Reserve policy mismanagement, the actions of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the Community Reinvestment Act. You certainly discussed the consequences of Dodd-Frank. Would you attribute the financial crisis, is that also a story of regulatory failure? I know it's a long, big issue here, but I'm wondering if you might speak to that as well, since we heard one other discussion of it.
Don't look to me. Is it working? Okay. Why don't you use this? Why don't you go ahead and...
Okay, the financial crisis. The Dodd-Frank Act was a consequence of the way we interpreted the financial crisis. The financial crisis was caused by government housing policy, which reduced underwriting standards, built an enormous bubble, and when that bubble collapsed, all those bad, low-quality mortgages, in fact, at the time, in 2008, there were 31 million subprime and other low-quality mortgages in the U.S. financial system, of which 76% were on the books of government agencies. So it was the government that created the demand for those mortgages, and when those mortgages failed, they caused all kinds of havoc in our financial system. But the point is that the narrative about the financial crisis was that it was caused by insufficient regulation of the banks and Wall Street. So they created this huge law to adjust for that or to remedy that, whereas, of course, the only thing they really had to do was to change our housing policy. They haven't done that, and so the government, because the government has incentives to reduce underwriting standards, it's cheap, builds the economy until there's a crash, but as long as the government is able to do that, the government is doing it again. That's why the title of my book, which is hidden in plain sight, What Caused the World's Financial Crisis and Why It Can Happen Again, is because we've focused all our attention on regulating banks and other financial institutions and no attention on what really caused the crisis, which was the government's housing policy.
Mine's working. I think it's working now. All right, so we have one from this side. Yes, over here. No.
I have a microphone. Vaughn Satrin from Redeemer University in Hamilton, Ontario. This question is for Randal O'Toole. Growth management laws, in those cities that you studied or areas that you studied, what are the reasons, what are the causes, why do they come up with them? And with that, I live in Hamilton, and the city is surrounded by the most fertile land, agricultural land in Ontario and probably North America. The city has come up with a plan that limits, they call it the Green Belt, where development can occur or cannot occur. Obviously, the real estate prices are through the roof. Development is booming in some parts of areas. So my question was that why do they come up with those regulations in those cities? What are the justification for those, and how does it or not advance the common good? Thank you.
Well, the interesting thing is that the justification for growth management seems to change day by day. One day we're doing it to protect prime farmland. And so we point out that in the United States we have 1.1 million acres of farmland, 1.1 billion acres of farmland, and we only grow crops on 350 million acres, about a third of the acreage. And that's declining because per acre crop productivities are growing faster than our population. So we're saving something that we have in abundance in order and increasing the cost of things that we have a shortage of. So then they say, well, we have to do it to reduce the amount of driving people do, because driving causes too much congestion. Well, it turns out when you increase population densities and you spend a whole lot of money on transit, you get almost no increase in transit ridership, and you don't reduce the amount of driving. It has almost no effect on it. So then they say, well, you have to reduce global warming. They say, well, you have to reduce teenage suicides. They come out with different reasons every single day. None of the reasons make sense. Really, it comes down to some people want to have power over others. In particular, I think it's a cultural clash. As of 1920, most people who owned single-family homes were middle class. And then because of the development of the automobile, the mass-produced automobile, working-class people could drive out to the countryside, buy cheap land, build a home without any regulations, and own their own home. And middle-class people resented the fact that these people who had different cultures, different tastes in music, different tastes in food, were living in homes like them. So you can look in the literature, the anti-sprawl literature of the 1930s to the 1950s, and they're saying, we don't like these people, let's pen them up in giant housing complexes, and that's what they're really trying to do.
Can I just jump in here? I think there's another factor in play. I just would like to get Randy's reaction, which is, aside from why these regulations initially came into place, you now have a large fraction of people in states like California who own homes whose value would drop dramatically if we were to eliminate land use restrictions. And so there's a built-in political clientele to maintain these restrictions. Just wanted to see if Randy agrees with that.
Well, that's absolutely true. And some of you might have heard of a little book by a man named Thomas Piketty called Capital. And he said that the returns on capital are growing faster than economic growth, and so therefore the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, a PhD student from MIT decided to look at Piketty's data and break it down, and he broke up capital into different categories like stocks and bonds and housing. And guess what? The only kind of capital in which the return was growing faster than economic growth was housing. And it was growing in countries like Europe and in cities like San Francisco because they've imposed these urban growth boundaries, and they've restricted development, restricted supply, and made housing costs go up fast. That's really benefited the upper classes that already own their own homes. It's harmed everyone else. And so the progressives who promote these plans are the ones who are benefiting from them. And now they're saying, oh, this is awful, that the rich are getting richer, so we need to tax the rich. But they're the ones who, if we wanted to tax the rich, what we should do is have like 100% tax on capital gains on your house, and not tax people's income or tax people's wealth.
All right, can we have this?
Yeah, in one of your last slides, you suggested a capital requirement for banks. The problem with that idea, it'd be great for Chase and Bank of America, but what about the regional and local banks in which the capital requirements may not be ever reached, yet those are the people who give the most of the loans to local people?
Well, all banks already have capital requirements. The question is at what level should they be set at, and can we simplify other aspects of the regulatory system if we have higher capital standards? And there also is very much in the United States and much of the rest of the, say, central banking community around the world, a push towards higher capital requirements on the larger banks under the view that they are the ones that pose the greatest systemic risk to the economy. And I think that's a reasonable argument as well. So the issue isn't whether we should have capital requirements or not, it's rather at what level should they be set, and what's the trade-off between capital requirements and regulatory complexity.
Yes.
Jonathan Warner, Quest University, Canada. The title of the forum this year is Markets, Government and the Common Good. Until 2 questions ago, the words the common good hadn't occurred in the forum so far. So as we're getting towards the end, I thought it was time to ask about them. I think primarily I'm interested in Mr. O'Toole's take. What would an environmental regulation that succeeds in furthering the common good actually look like? And can you give us some examples?
Well, let me give you an example. One of the arguments in favor of growth management is that by manipulating the way people live, we can reduce the amount of driving they do. Numerous studies have shown that while there is a statistically significant link between urban form and driving, it's too small to be useful in trying to protect the environment. On the other hand, back in 1970, America's major cities were filthy. The air was dirty. You couldn't see Mount Hood from the city of Portland because there was so much air pollution. And so we created the Environmental Protection Agency, passed the Clean Air Act, and the EPA did 2 things. It regulated tailpipe emissions with increasingly strict standards, and it encouraged cities to adopt policies aimed at reducing driving. And what happened was, today, the average car on the road produces 8% as much emissions as the average car in 1970. New cars produce 1% as much emissions. We've greatly cleaned up the air, and 105% of that increase in air quality, improvement in air quality, is due to cleaning up tailpipes. Negative 5% is due to cities' efforts to get people out of their car, because the way they tried to get people out of their car was they increased traffic congestion, and cars pollute more in congested traffic. It didn't get people out of their car, but it did increase pollution. So there are ways to protect the environment, and you need to study the individual issues and find out the best ways to protect it. If I were talking about water, it would be a completely different issue. But the ways to trying to manipulate lifestyle choices is not the solution to environmental protection.
All right, we have a question over here.
Could any of you comment on the fiduciary standard being proposed by the current administration as it relates to the securities industry?
Well, I guess I can make a stab at that. The requirement is that the people pay for advice from a fiduciary instead of paying commission when they buy and sell securities. So the question really is, who is being benefited or not benefited by that? If you are going to be paying 1.5% or something like that to your advisor, and you don't change your investments at all, you just put the money into a fund of some kind and leave it there, is that fair to you? Or should the people who are trading securities for you, your broker or dealer, should you pay for individual transactions like that? It really depends on how you are approaching the market. I think for most people, it would cost more to be paying a percentage for what they hold to some fiduciary than it would be if they just paid for each individual trade. And I think that's probably what the struggle is really about.
Just very quickly, I mean, it's a lot like occupational licensing. I mean, there's, in my view, there's in most cases a better option than occupational licensing is certification, and then let the consumer decide. I think this is another example where it's important that people who are getting financial advice understand the terms under which that advice is being given. And so I'm in favor of disclosure. I'm in favor of Truth in Lending Act, that type of thing. But mandating that you can only obtain financial service under a certain business model, I think is an example of the kind of intrusive regulation that we have been discussing and is, not the right way to go.
Nora Felton from Cannon Falls, Minnesota. I was just wondering if you had a study as to how much it costs in underutilized resources with all these regulations. My example would be we farm, so we have a semi. And in the winter, we used to always haul seed corn for Syngenta in Wisconsin. And then later on, they started clamping down where we had to meet all the DOT requirements of our 2 drivers to randomly drug test, et cetera, and do all the paperwork. Therefore, now the truck sits.
Well, I think this is just another example of the kind of regulation of banks that I was talking about, and that is for a large company to have the drug tests for drivers is not that difficult. If you don't have, or you have one person who's a compliance officer in your bank, and you get a 1,000-page regulation from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and you have to interpret that in order to do business or you're violating the law, then you have to have 2 compliance officers in your bank. And when you do that, that additional person is not out calling on customers, it is not producing revenue for you, is not reading applications for new lending, is just a dead weight cost to comply with a government regulation. So your point is very good for small businesses are hurt very much by these regulations, whereas larger businesses are able to handle them without any difficulty because they have much more assets, many more employees over which to spread the cost of that regulation.
But can you quantify it?
Well, you see, yes, you can quantify it, but the point I'm saying is that you can quantify it for each category of person, and we know that it's going to cost more as a percentage of revenue for the smaller institution than it is for the larger one. You can actually show what the cost is, but unfortunately, at the local level, with an individual small firm or a farmer, then you have to say, well, your cost will be a certain amount. Would that allow you to remain in business? And that becomes an extremely complicated thing because it depends on who you're competing with and what your other costs are. So that can be quantified. What really is very difficult to quantify is the cost for the society as a whole of something, a regulation of that kind, or the kind of regulation of banks that I was talking about in my presentation.
Right over here. Listening to the panel, I'm increasingly believing an idea I've been thinking about over the last little while, which is that on the whole, government regulation is a net bad for society. And we'd be better off if we used more regulation by market forces, such as the certification Professor Davis was just talking about. I'd like your opinion on that. To what extent do you think our regulatory agencies should be replaced by free market forces?
I'm hesitant to say 100%, but I think a lot of it could be done. I think we could have used free market forces to protect our water a lot more than we're doing. Might have been able to use them to protect air. I want to tell one story, as long as people are telling stories of regulation. The freest housing market in America is Houston, which has no zoning. Pasadena, the largest suburb of Houston, has no zoning. It's surrounded by county areas that have no zoning. And I spoke in a city where the home builders brought me in because their city was contemplating imposing growth management. And I lauded Houston as an example, and one of the home builders said, well, nobody wants to be like Houston. And I said, well, why did you say that? And he said, well, Houston, there's too much competition. You can't make a profit there. You need some regulation to be able to keep the small guys out so we can make a profit.
Yeah. There's, if I can just follow up on that, that's absolutely correct, that regulation can be done without the government, and it's done in the banking and financial area by something called market discipline. If people have to bear the risk of whatever investments they make, they are much more careful. However, in the case of banks, we have what are known as insured deposits. People say, well, my deposits are insured. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to look at the risks the bank is taking. So the government has to do it. And what we have to do, all of us who work in this area, is to make sure that we keep the government out, because every time the government steps into an area of finance, it causes what is called moral hazard, where people then stop worrying about the risks because the government is going to take that risks for them. And if they do that, the people who are running the businesses then are not subject to serious control. So at least in the banking and finance area, the idea is to keep the government out. Certainly in the housing finance area, it's to keep the government out. And to the extent that we can do that and have market players take the risk and pay for the risks that they are taking and be watched by their creditors very carefully, because there's no moral hazard, we would have a much safer, freer, and less costly system.
So I have a slightly different view. Part of the reason that the issue of regulation is so difficult is that there are some instances in which we do want some regulation. And you can point to examples where regulation has been successful, at least initially, in making us better off. Most people wanted regulation of air quality and water quality in the 1970s, and we got a lot of that, and there were improvements in air quality and water quality. We've gone overboard, I think. That's my view, and I think my panelists share that. Even in the financial regulation area, if you go back to something as basic as deposit insurance for banks, that was introduced in the 1930s, and by and large, that's regarded as a successful regulatory innovation over what came before in reducing the scope for harmful bank runs. So the difficulty is that these good arguments for regulation often get distorted by special interest groups, the businesses who want to profit off regulatory barriers to competition and so on. You get special interest groups that become, their financial welfare becomes tied to the regulation, as in the land use restrictions that we talked about earlier. And you get people who genuinely do want to be protected from certain types of dangers and harms that they worry about. The challenge facing us is to construct a sensible regulatory system. We're far away from that now. And I think we should recognize the challenges in doing that, but try to push back where we can. And there's lots of work to do in that regard.
All right, we have time for one more question, and it looks to be a former student from Hillsdale.
My question is for Mr. Davis. We've spoken a little bit about the problems with regulatory capture having to do with businesses, firms, things like that, looking for regulation to protect themselves and their industry. However, there are also, at least to my understanding, industries that are built on compliance with these regulations, like accountants interpreting the tax code and things like that. To what degree do individuals within those industries and the industries themselves pose a public choice problem with deregulation?
Yeah, there is a public choice problem. You're right, and it's another special interest group. It's not just the firms themselves who might benefit from regulations that restrict competition, as we talked about, but we do want an accounting industry. Okay, we want some public accounting industry, but there's no doubt that some aspects of the accounting industry. Let's take tax shifting. The U.S. has a territorial approach to taxation of individuals, and relevant to your question in terms of corporations. So that means corporations hire tax lawyers and accountants to figure out ways to recognize profits somewhere outside the high-tax U.S. jurisdiction and inside some other country's jurisdiction. Well, that is a consequence in part of our complex and poorly structured tax system that creates lots of jobs for smart, high-priced tax lawyers and accountants, and we as a society would be better off with a simpler tax system that then provided economic incentives for those smart people to do something else with their time and energies that actually added to the public good rather than just redistributing rents.
All right, well, why don't you keep up the clapping to thank our panel for being here, and then Anita will tell us what to do.